That's right, I just bought a 33-year-old Toyota Camry that's done 149,000 kilometers, about 92,000 miles for those in America. Is this car that's over 3 decades old still drivable and useful here today? Well, let's find out. This is the SV21 2-litre 4-cylinder Camry, pretty much one of the last Toyotas to not feature the iconic Toyota symbol, which was introduced 1 year prior in 1989. For a car of this vintage, it isn't in too bad of shape. There's a bit of clear coat fade and sadly some hail damage. The interior though is thankfully pretty neat and tidy already, a lot of that probably being due to its low mileage and lack of use in recent years. It's pretty original aside from the modern Kenwood Bluetooth head unit, and somehow the dials on the gauge cluster have actually bent slightly, perhaps due to excessive heat at some point. There are also some pretty new generic hubcaps, however the original ones are in the boot and we shall see if they can be restored later on in the video. This car has surprisingly had quite a bit spent on it in recent years. Here are some of the repairs and maintenance records I received with the car. First off, let's assess the car and give it a bit of a clean. Before activating the window squirters, I filled the tank. The battery is also in good health. Receipts were included showing it was installed just shy of 2 years ago. Around the rear windows there is a small amount of surface rust. I first clean, then sanded it back before applying a little bit of rust converter. I then covered it with some silver paint. I ended up also painting the black rubber strip black again afterwards. These spots are pretty small and don't look fresh. It's likely this was caused by debris sitting on it for a long time. Random scuffs around the bodywork looked a lot better after an application of paint. I simply used some silver spray paint that just so happened to match pretty well. The insides of the windows were in desperate need of a wipe. They seemed to build up gunk, and this becomes more noticeable in direct sunlight while driving. The steering wheel was also pretty sticky due to a buildup of, let's just say, gunk, but thankfully it comes off very easily. And oh boy, I'm only 8 burritos away from a free burrito. Now to inspect those original hubcaps that were included. All 4 as far as I can see. They are covered in brake dust, are very cracked, and have some gutter rash. I'll do my best to clean them up later in the video. Now let's try to remedy the quirks of this vehicle. I noticed that it appears to be idling a bit too high, but it sounds like it's idling normally. If it was actually idling high, it could be due to restricted airflow, so let's check the air filter. Given how old all the plastics are, I made sure to be very careful when releasing the clips. Flexing old hoses should be avoided as well, as they can split and you'll get what's called a vacuum leak, which may cause idling and or air to fuel ratio problems. After a lot of wiggling, we got a look at the air filter. It looks pretty clean, which makes sense since it wasn't that old according to service records. You can always bash some of the dust out if you don't think the filter is ready to be replaced yet. I'd recommend removing any debris that's accumulated inside the airbox while you've got it open as well. I also noticed that the tachometer sits at about 500 RPM before the engine even starts, which would explain why it appears as the engine is idling high. It starts and idles perfectly normally. The car came with an almost full tank of fuel, however it had apparently been sitting for well over 6 months. A good thing to do is run some fuel system cleaner through. I then filled the tank back up with more fuel, which will hopefully mix it around a bit. The wiper blades are also in need of attention. I'd rather not scratch the glass as the front window is apparently almost new. The old blades simply unclip, and be sure not to drop the wiper arms back on your window as they could shatter if you do this. Most replacement blades will come with a few different clips, one of which should fit snugly with your particular model. And now for the moment of truth, do the wipers and squirters work? Maybe not, but actually in hindsight it turns out I just actually didn't know how to use them. This car came with a little phone holder that clips onto the air vents. Due to my phone being large, I managed to snap part of it off. But that's nothing a bit of super glue can't fix. Old plastic vents aren't as strong as they used to be. If one of your rear lights isn't working, this little icon will actually show up on the dash. So I checked the rear lights. Tail lights work, turn signals work, but the right brake light doesn't seem to come on. Time to investigate further, and getting access to the globes is actually super easy. No screws required. Well, that doesn't look particularly good, does it now? When the brake pedal is pressed, the second brighter filament should illuminate. Maybe the old globe is just bad, so I tried a new one, but once again, it doesn't activate the brighter filament. For comparison's sake, here's the other side, very clean and free of corrosion. You can pretty much bet that it has to do with the corrosion on the grounding wire. I put on some WD-40 to loosen up the screw, which will hopefully come out. So far, not so good. The top of the screw is flaking away, but after a little more scrubbing and persistence, it came out. I sanded and brushed off all of the corrosion I could, making the surfaces clean for the ground to make contact. It ended up looking significantly better than before, so let's see whether it now works correctly. Clearly, it must have been a grounding issue as it works fine after the corrosion was removed. Now it's time to make some hubcap soup.
You'll need 4 old filthy hubcaps. Then season each with dishwashing detergent. Then fill with water. Make sure the ingredients are completely submerged. Mix it all up and leave to stew overnight.
Now the real work can begin. A lot of scrubbing to remove as much of the years of brake dust as possible. I probably don't really need to remove the stuff on the back, but since I'm going to all this effort, I might as well try. Next, I applied some wheel rim cleaner, which should help lift more of the hard to remove marks. The years of brake dust buildup feels almost impossible to get off, but it is slowly coming off with every clean, thankfully. Even the caked on stuff on the back is foaming up and lifting off the surface. There's no doubt that this is an improvement, but far from ideal. To remove the hard to reach brake dust, I used some spray and wipe combined with a soft brush on my rotary tool. This was definitely time consuming but effective. Let's see if we can get them looking like new again. Where there were any cracks, I applied some super glue. After a few hours clamped, it was time to respray the caps. The centers of these hubcaps are pretty good, with most of the scratches and damage on the outer parts only, so I masked around those so I wouldn't have to paint the Toyota logos back on. I then applied several coats throughout the day and moved on to other parts of the car. Let's change the oil as it's due for it, not by kilometers but time. It's actually not due for another 5,000 kilometers. But anyway, getting it up on the ramp without overshooting was a bit challenging in this car. And if you're ever using a ramp, put a chock behind the back wheel. Before draining out your old oil, get the car up to running temperature. You'll find the drainage point, known as the sump plug, on the bottom of the oil pan. It will be on pretty tight, and this one is using a big 19mm bolt. When you're removing it, be sure to keep track of the washer. In my case, it was fused to the top of the oil pan itself. Then I let it all drain out. Getting access to the oil filter is pretty easy in this engine, as you can see here, but don't burn yourself though, as it is right next to this heat shield. It was on too tight to loosen by hand, so I used a filter removal wrench which digs into the sides to help remove the filter. Be ready to catch any residual oil from the filter with a cloth, and make sure that the old filter comes off with its rubber seal. And when you're fitting the new filter, lubricate the new seal with some engine oil. Then thread the new one back on and do it up as tight as you can by hand. The sump plug can now be bolted back on, and make sure it's done up rather tight. New oil can be poured in through the top. I'd suggest using a funnel to avoid spilling it everywhere. Given what came out of the engine, it appears to take about 4 liters, so I poured just under that amount in there. Then when you start the car, the check oil light should go away after a few seconds. To get an accurate reading of the oil level, I put the car back on flat ground. I poured in pretty much exactly 4 liters, which seems to be spot on. I then decided to degrease the engine bay using some heavy-duty degreaser. You should try to avoid most of the electrical connections, and in hindsight, I probably shouldn't have done this at all, but it did clean the engine bay pretty well. I then made sure to dry off any standing water as well as drive the car around for a while. And oh no, I must have sprayed a bit of water somewhere where it shouldn't have gotten to, as the car wants to stall occasionally now. There's probably a bit of moisture under the ignition leads. I disconnected both the spark plug and distributor ends, and after a few hours, it was idling and running great again. After several coats of paint, the cleaned up hubcaps can now go back on. The paint I sprayed on seems to be a pretty good match. While the generic hubcaps are okay, I much prefer the originals, which after a bit of fiddling clip on nice and securely. The old hubcaps really complete the look. It's a good looking car, and the paint fade isn't that noticeable. I put the best hubcaps on the driver's side to avoid further gutter rash and damage. One of the downsides to this would be that the car has very soft suspension though. So when driving with worn out shock absorbers or soft shock absorbers, the car will tend to have a worth stopping distance because all that weight wants to shift forwards. And in an emergency, if you need to brake suddenly with that weight shifting forwards, there's a good chance that the rear wheels might actually lose traction and slide. Also, turning sharply if you need to avoid a pedestrian or potentially a car in front of you might also be hampered because the body will tend to roll a little more than if it had good shocks. And now let's get out on the road and see how it goes.
Yeah, I mean, it's relatively quiet and comfortable, but yeah, as we were saying before, you do notice the rolling a little bit when you turn sharply because of the soft suspension. So we'll just take a little trip around here and just have a little bit of a cruise, I think. Woo, that sun is hot. Yeah, once again, there's next to no UV protection at all, and in direct sunlight, it's kind of bitey, I'll admit. But just driving it around here, it's comfortable. If the roads are smooth, it's honestly fine to drive around in. When it gets bumpy, that's when things are a little bit different. But a soft suspension isn't the end of the world when the roads are good. But here we go. A little bit of a bump there. That's sort of... And as far as comfort goes, it's perfectly fine. The AC works, the heater works, the demisters work, everything works as far as I can tell, everything I've checked. Even the wipers, the squirters, all that works. Stuff that, little things that might go wrong on an old car, this seems to have working fine. And even the windows, they go down and they go up without any problem at all. But of course, you just got to be mindful. You are driving an old car with very few safety features. So you got to be careful, there aren't any airbags. If you get T-boned, you're going to feel it. And by feel it, I mean, you're probably not going to feel it because you won't be living anymore. But if you just drive cautiously, take it easy, don't do anything stupid, a car like this, even with soft suspension, can be relatively safe. But you have got to be proactive in making sure that you stay safe. Okay, so we'll give it a bit of throttle here and we'll see how it goes. So, if you put the foot down a little bit, the engine sounds pretty good, and it does pick up fine. I've driven this at highway speeds and it ran along good. The engine is strong. It's a low kilometer car.
It's an easy to drive car. The recently replaced power steering rack means it turns like butter. The seats are also super comfy, and for a 33-year-old car, they're in great condition. Toyota really made an easy to work on, dependable little nugget of a car here. Even though it's very old, it sips fuel, meaning it's an economical A to B car. Registration as well as insurance is also very cheap. You really don't see many clean Camrys like this on the road anymore. There are no leaks either, since it was taken care of. It's a very utilitarian car, a no-frills Camry. And at the time, there were even options for ones with a V6 engine, cruise control. Yes, 33 years ago, there was cruise control, electric windows, and also electric seatbelts. Something that didn't catch on and honestly is a horrible idea. But something simple like this means this thing's gonna last. There's no power windows to fail, although I guess the window regulators could also fail, but less likely to fail than if they were electric. And because it's so simple, 33 years later, pretty much everything in this car works, and it's still a nice car to drive, minus the very soft suspension. Thanks for watching, I hope you've really enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more, definitely consider subscribing and maybe consider becoming a channel member for a few extra perks and to help me make more videos just like this. Thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next one.